Marie, and in this presentation, I will be giving an overview of the beautiful country of Brazil. Brazil lies on the east coast of the South American continent, covering 4,500 miles of the Atlantic coast. Brazil is quite geographically diverse because it is so large. In the northwestern portion of the country lies the immense Amazon rainforest and Amazon River. There are also pampas, mountains, and coastal plains to the southeast. Brazil is a primarily Portuguese-speaking nation with a population of roughly 208 million people. The capital of Brazil is Brasilia, but the largest cities are Rio de Janeiro, with a population of 6.7 million, and Sao Paulo, with a population of 14.7 million. Now let's dive into Brazil's rich and interesting history. Europeans first began settling in what is now known as Brazil in the 16th century. With the settlers came diseases that soon wiped out a large portion of the population of indigenous peoples. Nonetheless, the Europeans began taking indigenous women as their partners, creating a largely mixed-race culture that persists today. The European settlers, more specifically Portuguese, sought to bring an export economy to Brazil by starting massive plantations and shipping the resources back to Europe. With this export economy came the massive growth of slavery in Brazil, aided by the transatlantic slave trade. The main export became coffee and sugar, with massive slave-using plantations to help this fast-growing economy. So how did Brazil go from being one of Portugal's export colonies to the great nation it is today? Well, the story of Brazilian independence is a unique one, and it goes like this. When Napoleon invaded Portugal in 1807, the King Dom João of Portugal fled to Brazil with his family and arrived in Rio de Janeiro in 1808. Dom João brought a new age to Brazil as he significantly opened up trade and commerce where there had been Portuguese restrictions before. When Napoleon was defeated and Dom João's mother died, he went back to Portugal and left his son Dom Pedro in charge. However, the Cortes, the lawmaking body in Portugal, felt that Dom João had given Brazil too much economic freedom and wanted to take back the privilege they had granted before. Dom Pedro was not in favor of this and began to start an independence movement. From 1821 to 1822, several Brazilian provinces, starting with Bahia, began to unite against the Portuguese rule and join the constitutional movement. In September of 1822, Dom Pedro declared independence from Portugal. Now let's cover some current aspects of Brazil's socio-political landscape. Religion is an important cultural aspect of any nation, and Brazil is no different. Brazil is an incredibly religious nation, even more so than its neighboring nations, with only 1% of its population not believing in God. Although Brazil is home to a plenitude of different religions, the primary ideology is Roman Catholicism, as Brazil has the highest number of Roman Catholics in the world. However, Brazil's religious landscape is changing rapidly. The number of Protestants in Brazil has skyrocketed from just 5% of the population in 1970 to nearly a fourth of the population in 2010. The most pronounced group in the rise of Protestantism has been Pentecostalism. Half of Pentecostals are former members of the Catholic Church who switched over in order to find a closer personal connection with God. Another trend finds that more Catholics tend to be among an older generation, and the majority of rural Brazilian citizens identify as Catholic. In comparison, younger and more urban Brazilians are more likely to identify with a religion other than Catholicism. This may be because city dwellers are exposed to a more diverse environment, and younger people tend to be more impressionable in terms of conversion. It is clear that religion has a crucial role in Brazil's culture. So how does this affect the LGBTQ community in Brazil? The LGBT community in Brazil has come a long way in the past 10 years in regards to gaining rights. Same-sex marriage was legalized in 2013, and gender changes had become legitimized. Under President Rousseff, the community saw an advancement in their rights and recognition, even though the nation was still the deadliest place to be a transgender. However, along with this gradual gaining of rights has come a backlash from traditional groups such as evangelicals, which have grown to a third of the country. Furthermore, with the election of Jair Bolsonaro, a man who is a self-proclaimed homophobe, the backlash has been legitimized and made acceptable. Since Bolsonaro's election, there has been serious fear spreading through the LGBTQ community that their rights will be taken away and that they will be victims of the country's high rate of LGBTQ hate crimes. Some bills that propose invalidating same-sex families in need of health care and welfare have been brought to light under Bolsonaro's new administration. Although LGBTQ rights may be on thin ice in Brazil, the nation has made a step for universal rights in another area, healthcare. Ever since Brazil's 1988 constitution, the Brazil's healthcare has been made universal and accessible by all people within Brazil, even foreigners. Since the emergence of public healthcare in Brazil, life expectancy has increased and infant mortality rates have decreased substantially. Although there have been improvements, public health care in Brazil pales in comparison to its private sector, which richer Brazilians tend to rely on. Because Brazil is such a diverse and massive nation, it is difficult for the government to provide equal access to all of its citizens, rural to urban. The 60% of the country that do utilize the public medical centers mostly just receive vaccinations and emergency care. However, the public centers tend to focus on preventative care in communities, which is helpful for implementing healthy practices within poorer communities. Looking toward the future, with an emergence of a new far-right leader in Brazil, it's hard to say where the Brazilian healthcare system will go, but we can hope that it will continue to improve the lives of millions of Brazilians. Some Brazilians that may find it hard to find a healthcare center would be indigenous groups. Since colonial times, European elites have used their technologies and economic influence to take advantage of the indigenous peoples of Brazil, even after the Brazilian Revolution. Wealthy white men have found other ways to assert their dominance, especially through agribusiness and mining, in which they have seized much of the land that historically belonged to the Guarani tribe. The current Brazilian government has a specific department that deals with indigenous affairs named FUNAI. Just a couple years ago, President Temer stripped funds from FUNAI and has sided with mining, logging, and agribusiness companies that serve to boost the Brazilian economy. Because these large corporations are seizing historically indigenous land and the natives are searching for means to get by, they often work on these large farms under inhumane and slave-like conditions. Several indigenous advocacy groups have faced death threats, and several more have faced murder. However, as this issue comes to light, indigenous land right groups gain more and more supporters. With a balance of organization and widespread support, these groups may finally acquire the land and rights they need and they rightfully deserve. As we gather a more wholesome view of Brazil, it is incredibly important to tune in to how the various cultural and political aspects of this nation have put it in the place that it is in today. The people of Brazil have faced numerous hardships, specifically the indigenous peoples and the economically disadvantaged. Although much progress has been made when it comes to the rights of indigenous, LGBTQ, and low-income Brazilians, the election of new Jair Bolsonaro might force these groups several years back on the timeline of progress. However, if we continue to educate people around the world on these issues, and on Brazil in general, perhaps people will begin to pay more attention to these injustices and fight back, creating a more inclusive and just nation.